My son asked why Grandpa cried every birthday. The answer had been waiting 15 years to be told. I want to start with the exact moment my son asked, because I've thought about it so often since. We were clearing plates after his 15th birthday dinner, and he said it quietly, almost offhandedly, the way children ask the questions that matter most. Mom, why does Grandpa always cry a little at my birthday? He's done it every single year. I stood there with a stack of dishes in my hands, realizing I had noticed the same thing myself for 15 years and had never once asked. Hello, my name is Emily, and this is the story of the tears my father-in-law shed quietly at every one of my son's birthdays. Tears he always waved off with a joke about allergies or old age. And the answer, finally spoken aloud on an ordinary evening after 15 years of careful silence, that changed how our entire family understood him. This isn't a story about a secret sorrow hiding something painful in the present. This is a story about a man named Walter. 15 years he never got to live, and a single date that came to hold both the worst loss and the greatest gift of his entire life. I think you should understand, before I describe those birthdays, what kind of man Walter was, because I don't want you to imagine a family clouded by unresolved tension. Walter was warm, steady, endlessly generous with his time. The kind of grandfather who showed up early to every school event and remembered every small detail of his grandson's life. The tears at each birthday were the single unexplained thread in an otherwise open and affectionate relationship, which is exactly why they lingered in my mind the way they did, small and persistent, year after year. I want to say, too, that I came from a family where emotions were discussed openly, where tears at happy occasions were common enough that I rarely thought twice about them. It was only the specific consistency of Walter's tears, the same moment nearly every year, the same brief disappearance and quiet return, that eventually made me start paying closer attention, the way a familiar song can suddenly catch your ear differently once you notice it repeating in the background of your life. I met Walter the same year I met his son Mark, at a family barbecue early in our relationship, and I liked him immediately. A quiet, thoughtful man with an easy laugh and a habit of listening more than he spoke. It was only gradually, over the years that followed, that I noticed the particular quality of reserve that sat underneath his warmth, a carefulness in how he spoke about certain stretches of his own past, a tendency to redirect conversation whenever the subject drifted too close to Mark's early childhood. Ben, our son, was born in early spring, and Walter was there at the hospital within hours, holding his first grandchild with a tenderness that struck me even then as somehow larger than the moment seemed to call for. Tears streaming freely down his face while the rest of us simply smiled and cooed over the new baby. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was simply the ordinary overwhelm of new grandfatherhood, and it wasn't until Ben's first birthday, a year later, that I noticed the tears had returned, just as suddenly, just as difficult for Walter to explain. I want to describe, too, the specific texture of Walter's presence in Ben's life outside of those birthdays, because I think it matters for understanding just how little the tears seem to fit the rest of his character. He never missed a school play, sat through Little League games in folding chairs on cold spring mornings, taught Ben to fish at a small lake near his house every summer without fail. He was, in every ordinary sense, the picture of an easy, devoted grandfather, which made the yearly tears feel even stranger by contrast, a single dissonant note in an otherwise steady, cheerful melody. Every year after that, the pattern repeated itself with a consistency that eventually became impossible to overlook. At some point during each birthday celebration, usually while Ben blew out his candles or unwrapped a gift Walter had chosen especially carefully, Walter's eyes would fill, and he would excuse himself briefly, always returning a few minutes later with some light, self-deprecating comment about getting sentimental in his old age. I asked Mark about it early on, in the first couple of years, expecting a simple explanation, that Walter had always been an emotional man, or that grandchildren simply brought out something soft in him he'd never shown as a younger father. Mark told me, a little vaguely, that his father had always been sentimental about birthdays, an answer that satisfied me for a while, though I noticed, even then, a slight hesitation in how he delivered it, as though there were more to the story he wasn't yet ready to share. There is a particular birthday, Ben's 7th, that I still think about often. Walter had stepped outside during the cake, and I followed him a few minutes later, finding him sitting alone on our back porch steps, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. When I asked, gently, if he was all right, he told me he was simply grateful, more grateful than he could easily put into words, for the chance to watch Ben grow up. I remember the specific weight in how he said it, the chance, as though watching a grandchild grow were something that could not be taken for granted, something he understood, on some deep level, not everyone gets to have. I mentioned the pattern once to my own mother, describing it the way you might describe any small, recurring family quirk. She suggested, reasonably enough, that some men of Walter's generation simply weren't given permission, growing up, to express emotion openly, and that birthdays, as milestones marking the passage of time, often became the one acceptable outlet for feelings they'd spent a lifetime suppressing elsewhere. For a while, that explanation was enough to let the question rest, unresolved but no longer urgent, tucked away in the same mental drawer where I kept all the small unanswered mysteries of family life. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who has ever noticed a small, recurring pattern in someone they love, without ever quite finding the moment to ask about it directly. I think there's a particular kind of patience that comes from trusting a relationship enough to let a question sit unanswered for years, not because the answer doesn't matter, but because some truths, you sense instinctively, will only be offered when the person carrying them finally feels ready, and pushing too soon risks closing a door that patience might eventually open on its own. It was Ben's own question, arriving so simply and directly after 15 years of birthdays, that finally opened that door. That evening, after the guests had left and the kitchen was mostly clean, I found Walter still sitting at our dining table, and I asked him gently whether he would be willing to answer the question Ben had asked me earlier. He was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice steadier than I expected, he said it was probably time. He told us, that evening, about a chapter of his life he had never shared with any of us in detail. A 15-year stretch during his 30s and 40s when he had been wrongfully convicted of a crime he did not commit, a robbery at a warehouse where he had once worked, built on the mistaken testimony of a coworker under pressure, and a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. He told us he had spent 15 years in prison for something he never did, years that took him away from Mark's entire childhood, years he described, quietly, as the ones that had cost him more than he ever fully recovered from. In other words, what I had spent 15 years mistaking for simple sentimentality was in fact a grief so specific and so carefully guarded that Walter had never found a way to speak it aloud until his own grandson asked a direct enough question that avoiding it any longer finally felt impossible. Walter told us the trial itself had lasted only 3 days, a short, brutal blur he still, decades later, struggled to recall in full detail. The co-worker's mistaken testimony delivered with a confidence that had convinced the jury far more thoroughly than the thin physical evidence ever should have. He said he remembered standing in the courtroom as the verdict was read, watching his own mother's face collapse in the gallery, and feeling, in that instant, a kind of disbelief so total it had taken him years in prison to fully accept that the life he'd known was actually gone, replaced by one he had done nothing to deserve. He told us about the specific ache of missing Mark's childhood entirely, receiving letters and photographs through the prison mail system, watching his son grow up almost entirely through second-hand accounts, and visiting room conversations limited to a single hour every few weeks. He told us his own mother, Mark's grandmother, had raised Mark largely on her own during those years, doing her best to explain his father's absence, in terms a young boy could understand without either lying to him or breaking his heart before he was old enough to carry the fuller truth. He described the specific ritual he had built for himself inside prison to survive those years, keeping a small notebook where he wrote down every detail Mark's grandmother shared in her letters. The day Mark lost his first tooth, his first day of school, the year he broke his arm falling from a tree in the backyard. Walter told us he had read that notebook so many times the pages had gone soft at the edges, trying to build, from second-hand fragments, some version of the childhood he was missing in real time. He said the hardest part was never the missed birthdays themselves, but the ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday afternoons he knew he was also losing, the small accumulating days that make up the actual texture of raising a child, days no letter could ever fully capture. He told us, too, about the toll those years took on his marriage to Mark's mother, who visited faithfully for the first several years before the distance and the disbelief of their small town many of whom assumed his guilt despite the thin evidence against him, eventually wore the relationship down past what either of them could sustain. He said losing his marriage alongside his freedom had been its own quiet grief, one he rarely spoke about even to Mark, layered underneath the larger loss of the years themselves. Walter described the day his conviction was finally overturned, 15 years into his sentence, when new evidence, a re-examined piece of forensic testing unavailable at the time of his original trial, proved conclusively that he could not have been at the scene of the crime. He told us about walking out of the prison gates on a bright spring morning, blinking against sunlight he hadn't felt uninterrupted in 15 years, and being met, in the parking lot, not only by his own elderly mother but by his son Mark, then a young man of 19, who had driven 3 hours that morning simply to be the first face his father saw as a free man. He told us, and this was the detail that finally made the pieces fall fully into place, that on that exact same morning, in a hospital across town, Mark's girlfriend at the time, a young woman Walter had never met, was giving birth to their first child, a daughter who did not survive the delivery. Mark had learned of the loss by phone only hours before driving to meet his father, carrying both the devastating news of his daughter's death and the overwhelming relief of his father's release within the very same morning, a collision of grief and freedom so enormous that Walter said he had never fully found language sturdy enough to describe it, even to himself. Walter told us that in the years that followed, he and Mark rarely spoke directly about that particular morning, the day freedom and unbearable loss had arrived within hours of each other, each of them privately carrying a version of grief the other could only partially understand. He said that when Ben was born, years later, on a date that fell almost exactly on the anniversary of his own release from prison, something in him broke open in a way he hadn't expected, watching a healthy, thriving grandchild grow older each year on a date that had once marked both his own hard-won freedom and the loss of a granddaughter he never got to meet. He told us he had gone, quietly and alone, to visit his infant granddaughter's small grave every year on the morning of Ben's birthday for the first several years, a private ritual he never mentioned to Mark, driving out before the party each time to sit for a few minutes beside a headstone that read simply her name and a single date before returning home to celebrate the grandson who had, in his own words, given him a reason to keep unwrapping that morning instead of just grieving it. He said he had eventually stopped needing to make that drive every year, though the tears at Ben's party had never quite stopped arriving on their own, an old habit of the heart that outlasted the ritual which had first shaped it. I asked him, gently, why he had never told any of us the fuller story before, even privately, across 15 years. He told me it had never felt like his story alone to tell, that the daughter Mark and his girlfriend had lost belonged first to their grief, and that he had never wanted his own emotional reaction at Ben's birthdays to somehow overshadow the joy of celebrating a healthy, living child. He said he had made a quiet decision, years earlier, to let his tears remain a small, private mystery rather than risk casting even a shadow of sorrow over a day meant entirely for Ben's happiness. I sat at that table for a long while after he finished, turning over 15 years of small, unexplained tears, understanding, finally, exactly what they had been holding all along. I felt no discomfort at the revelation, only a slow, deepening tenderness for a man who had carried an entire, complicated history of loss and reclaimed freedom so quietly that he had let us believe, for over a decade, that it was nothing more than an old man's sentimentality. I remember reaching for his hand across the table, an ordinary gesture that felt, in that moment, entirely inadequate to the size of what he had just handed us. 15 years of injustice and 15 more of quiet, guarded grief, offered finally into the light simply because his own grandson had been brave enough to ask a direct question. I told him I was grateful he'd trusted us with it, and he told me, with a small, tired smile, that it had never been about trust. It had simply taken him this long to find a version of the story he could tell without falling apart entirely in the telling. Mark spoke for the first time that evening, too, about the daughter he and his first girlfriend had lost, a story I had known only in the barest outline before, and about how strange and impossible that single morning had felt, gaining his father back after 15 years while losing a daughter he had barely had the chance to hold. He told Ben, gently, that his existence, born a few years later, had become, For both Mark and Walter, an enormous quiet gift, a second chance at the ordinary joy that first loss had made feel suddenly, achingly uncertain. He told Ben, too, about the years right after Walter's release, how strange it had felt for both of them to learn how to be father and son again after 15 years apart. Walter returning to a world that had moved on considerably without him. Mark grown into an adult his father had barely gotten to know. He said they had gone to counseling together for the better part of 2 years, slowly relearning each other, and that the process had taught him more about patience and forgiveness than almost anything else in his life. Listening to him describe it, I understood that the quiet strength I had always admired in Mark, his steadiness, his refusal to hold grudges even in small everyday frustrations, had been built, in large part, inside that difficult, deliberate rebuilding. I want to tell you what happened after that conversation, because I think the slow unfolding of it matters as much as the 15 years of quiet, unanswered wondering that came before. Ben, at 15, absorbed the story with a seriousness beyond his years, and in the months that followed, I noticed a new tenderness in how he treated his grandfather, lingering a little longer after visits, asking careful, thoughtful questions about the years Walter rarely spoke of otherwise. A few weeks later, Ben asked Walter if he could see the old notebook, the one filled with second-hand fragments of Mark's childhood, and Walter brought it over one Sunday afternoon, the two of them sitting together at our kitchen table turning its soft, worn pages for nearly 2 hours. I watched from the next room, unwilling to interrupt, as Ben asked question after question, and Walter answered each one slowly, visibly relieved, I think, to finally have someone curious enough to receive the fuller story he had carried alone for so long. Ben also asked, eventually, if he could visit his aunt's grave with Walter the following spring, and the two of them made the drive together quietly one Saturday morning. Ben later telling me only that it had felt important to go, without needing to explain much further than that. I think about that drive often. Two people 15 years apart in age, connected by a loss neither of them had directly caused, choosing together to finally give it the visible acknowledgement it had waited so long to receive. I think about those 15 birthdays often now. The specific ache of watching someone I loved cry year after year without ever understanding why. And I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who has ever noticed an unexplained sorrow in someone they love without finding quite the right moment to ask about it directly, not every unexplained tear points towards something troubling in the present. Sometimes it points toward an entire buried history of loss and survival that the person carrying it has simply never found language sturdy enough to speak aloud. I want to offer a few reflections for anyone listening who recognizes their own version of this story. Some quiet, unexplained sorrow in someone they love that has never quite been fully accounted for. Know that grief and gratitude often live tangled together in ways that don't resolve neatly, and a person capable of both weeping and smiling at the same happy occasion is not being strange or difficult. They are simply carrying the full, complicated truth of what that occasion actually means to them. Understand that some stories take 15 years, or longer, to feel safe enough to tell, and that timeline is rarely about how much someone trusts you. It is usually about how long it takes them to find a version of the truth they can finally speak without breaking under its weight. Give yourself permission to ask the gentle, direct questions that children so often ask instinctively. Ben's simple question, offered without any agenda beyond genuine curiosity, accomplished in a single sentence what 15 years of my own careful, patient wondering never quite managed to. Learn to recognize that a person can hold devastating loss and genuine joy in the very same breath, and that neither one cancels the other out. Walter's tears at Ben's birthdays were never a contradiction of his happiness. They were the fullest, most honest expression of it. Grief and gratitude woven so tightly together that separating them would have meant losing something true about both. Remember that injustice leaves marks that outlast the years it directly occupies. Walter's 15 years in prison shaped the rest of his life in ways none of us fully understood until he finally described them. And extending patience to the people we love who carry invisible histories is one of the deepest forms of respect we can offer them. Consider, too, how easily a family's public story can flatten a person's private one. To much of our small town, Walter had simply been a man once accused, later cleared, a story people summarized in a sentence or two before moving on. To us, he was so much more than that summary could ever hold. A father who rebuilt a relationship from almost nothing, A grandfather who mourned a grandchild he never met while celebrating one he adored. A man who carried an entire private universe of loss and endurance that no courtroom verdict could ever fully capture. And believe, finally, that the people we love most often carry entire private worlds of grief and gratitude we know nothing about, not out of secrecy in any troubling sense, but simply because some truths require both time and the right question before they're ready to be spoken. Sometimes all it takes is one honest evening and the plain, unguarded curiosity of a child to finally understand the fuller shape of who someone truly is. Walter still cries a little at every one of Ben's birthdays, though now, when he does, Ben simply moves to sit beside him, and the rest of us let the moment be exactly what it has always been: grief and gratitude arriving together, the way they often do for people who have survived more than the rest of us ever fully see. At Ben's most recent birthday, I watched Ben lean over and quietly tell his grandfather it was okay, that he understood now, and watched Walter nod, wipe his eyes, and pull his grandson into a hug that lasted a little longer than usual, the whole table waiting patiently, warmly, for the two of them to be ready to rejoin the celebration. I think often about how close I came to letting 15 years of quiet, unanswered wondering pass without ever understanding the man at the center of it, and I am endlessly grateful that my son's simple, honest question finally gave Walter the opening he had been waiting 15 years to receive. I think, too, about how much of family life is built exactly this way, in small, unexplained gestures we carry for years without ever quite asking about, each one holding, if we're patient enough to eventually find out, an entire private history of love, loss, and quiet endurance we could never have guessed from the outside. If this story brought some value to your life, please consider clicking like. It is the only way we know this content was truly meaningful to you.